Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Hosea chapters 4 through 11, where we read about God's covenant lawsuit with his nation. We've already seen an overview of the book of Hosea. Chapters 1 through 3 describe Hosea's marriage, where he's called upon to take a wife of unfaithfulness. And we read about Gomer's, both of her unfaithfulness, Gomer's her name, and how Hosea disciplines her, purchases her back, and then restores her eventually as his wife. And that is a picture of what God is going to do with Israel. And we see this laid out now in Hosea's message. It's really in two major parts. Chapters 4 through 11 give the case of God's covenant lawsuit, showing how Israel has played the part of that unfaithful bride. And we'll see that for chapters 4 through 11. In the last chapter, we're going to see a song, hoping that it's a song picturing the return of the bride. And then chapter 12 through 14, this time we see scattered throughout the same message a number of references to Israel's past history of unfaithfulness. She's been unfaithful in the past, she's being unfaithful now, but at the end, in chapter 14, there's going to be a promise of future restoration. So we begin in chapter 4 and verse 1. Listen to the word of the Lord, O sons of Israel. And here's the language for the covenant lawsuit. For the Lord has a case. And this is language that you would use when you're accusing somebody of having broken a covenant. Now remember, to break a covenant was a serious thing. When you made a covenant, you actually cut a covenant. What you were doing is you were placing a curse upon yourself if you broke the terms of the covenant. So in the same way that you would cut a covenant, if you wanted to be very formal about it, you would take an animal and kill it and then cut it apart. And what you were saying by entering into the covenant was that if you broke the terms of the covenant, may you be killed as well. Well, notice the Lord has a case against the inhabitants of the land because there is no faithfulness or kindness. And here I think is going to be the key repeated term used throughout the rest of the book of Hosea. And that will be the word knowledge, yada, or this in this case is sort of a subset of that, just like yada is to know, and then knowledge is you add a little bit more. Same thing in Hebrew, or knowledge of God in the land, and that's the problem. There was no knowledge of God. Now you say, wait a minute, they had the Torah, they knew about God, but you will remember back in the book of Genesis when you wanted to describe a close intimacy. You would say, for example, that Adam knew his wife, and it doesn't just mean that Adam, hi, I'm Adam, you're Eve. We have an acquaintance, but rather there was an intimate knowing, and that's the problem. That lack of intimacy of God with His people. That's the problem that's going to be spotlighted here. Verse 2, there is swearing, deception, murder, stealing, and adultery. And what we've just done, we've just gone through a number of the 10 commandments, the 10 words that set forth the basic stipulations of the covenant. They employ violence so that bloodshed follows bloodshed. It compounds with each other. Sin leads to greater sin. Verse 4, let no one find fault, and let none offer reproof, for your people are like those who contend with the priests. The priest is supposed to represent you, so if you're contending with the priest, if you're fighting with the priest, you're fighting the one who's representing you to God. How can you do that? Verse 5, so you will stumble by day, and the prophet also will stumble with you by night, and I will destroy your mother. Verse 6, my people are destroyed, there it is again, for lack of knowledge, because you have rejected knowledge. There was a knowledge problem among the people of God. And because you have rejected knowledge, I will also, notice they rejected, so God's going to reject too. I will also reject you from being my priest. Israel had been called to be a nation of priests. That is, the nation itself was to represent the human race to God. They were the mediator between God and man. And God says, no longer I've rejected you from being my priest, since you have forgotten the law of your God. I will also forget your children. We jump down to verse 11. Harlotry, wine, and new wine take away the understanding. Lack of knowledge, a different term, but same idea. Lack of understanding. My people consult their wooden idol, and their diviner's wand informs them. For a spirit of harlotry, notice how we still have that spiritual adultery, that spiritual faithfulness. For a spirit of harlotry has led them astray, and they have played the harlot, departing from their God. Now, notice when it talks about the spirit of harlotry and the harlot, it's speaking really not just of a lack of loyalty, but a betrayal, because that's what marital unfaithfulness is. It's a betrayal of that spouse. And God says, "You have betrayed me. You have become traitors against me and against my kingdom." Verse 13, they offer sacrifices on the tops of the mountains and burn incense on the hills under oak, poplar, and terebinth, because their shade is pleasant. Therefore, your daughters play the harlot, and notice the harlotry again, and adultery, and your brides commit adultery. And so we're talking both physical adultery, but also spiritual adultery, because all sin is spiritual adultery. And so they're being accused of playing the harlot and committing adultery. Verse 14, I will not punish your daughters when they play the harlot, or your brides when they commit adultery. He's just accused them of doing that. But notice, he doesn't hold them as accountable as he holds, notice the next line, for the men themselves go apart with harlots and offer sacrifices with temple prostitutes. So the people without understanding are ruined. As go the leaders, and in this case, the leaders of the men, so will go the followers being described as the woman in this case. It's a dangerous thing to be a bad leader, because you will have your followers go in that direction. And so again, the people without understanding, remember we already said without knowledge, here's without understanding, just a synonym for the same idea, they are ruined. We jump down to chapter 5. I know Ephraim, and Ephraim, of course, was the strongest, sort of the leader among the tribes of the 10 northern tribes. I know Ephraim, and Israel is not hidden from me. For now, O Ephraim, you have played the harlot. Israel has defiled itself. Their deeds will not allow them to return to their God, for a spirit of harlotry is within them, and they do not know the Lord. Again, the big idea here, the repeated refrain, is a lack of knowledge of the Lord. Verse 5, moreover, the pride of Israel testifies against him, and Israel and Ephraim stumble in their iniquity. Judah has also stumbled with them. So our attention is primarily upon the northern kingdom, but the southern kingdom is not without its sin as well, and every once in a while they're going to be mentioned. Verse 6, they will go with their flocks and herds to seek the Lord, but they will not find him. He has withdrawn from them. Because they didn't want God, because they didn't know God, now the opportunity to know God is pulled back and pulled away from them. Verse 7, they have dealt treacherously against the Lord, for they have borne illegitimate children. This is a picture of an unfaithful wife who, in her unfaithfulness, has borne children as a fruit of that unfaithfulness. And then the husband says, well, those aren't mine. You're not mine. And that's what's taking place in the land, again, in a spiritual sense. They've borne out illegitimate children, and now the new moon will devour them with their land. In other words, it's not going to be perpetual. They're not going to get away with this long term. We come down to chapter 6 and verse 4. What shall I do with you, O Ephraim? What shall I do with you, O Judah? For your loyalty is like a morning cloud and like the dew which goes away early. Now, the term loyalty, a familiar Hebrew word to anybody that's studied any sort of Hebrew, chesed. Sometimes we translate that loving kindness. I actually prefer the translation loyalty. If I had my way, I think we'd always render it that way. But we're going to see the translators here render it a number of different ways. Here's loyalty. And notice what's being said. Yes, you have loyalty, but it doesn't last. There's no staying power to your loyalty. It's like the morning cloud. It's there in the morning. By the time you get to mid-afternoon, it's gone. Like the dew, which goes away early. When the sun first comes up and there's a little bit of dew on the plants, but you go an hour into it and it's dissipated. And that's the way your loyalty is toward me, God says. Verse 6, for I delight, there's the same term, in loyalty rather than sacrifice, and in the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. So God wants both. Yes, he wants knowledge, but he also wants a loyalty that corresponds with that. And he'd prefer to have that than the rituals. Notice, loyalty rather than sacrifice, knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. But here's the problem, verse 7. But like Adam, they have transgressed the covenant. So here's a reference here that takes you all the way back to Genesis chapter 3 when Adam transgressed the covenant. You say, well, was there a covenant back then? The word covenant is not used until Genesis chapter 6. But yes, I think the idea of the covenant was all the way back at the beginning of creation. And notice that Israel is following the footsteps of their earthly forebear. Like Adam, they've transgressed the covenant. There they have dealt treacherously against me. Verse 8, Ephraim, and now we're in chapter 7, verse 8. Ephraim mixes himself with the nations. Ephraim has become a cake not turned. It's not balanced. It's doing something wrong. It's become spoiled. Strangers devour his strength, yet he does not know it. Again, the lack of knowledge. Gray hairs also are sprinkled on him, yet he does not know it. So here, there's things happening that are misunderstood because God's people have stopped being God's people. They have ignored God. They've turned away from God, and they've lost their sense of identity. They have lost their identity. God has said, "You're no longer mine," and yet he does not know it. And notice that refrain: "Strangers devour his strength, yet he does not know it. Gray hairs are also sprinkled on him, yet he does not know it." He doesn't know that he's losing his strength. He doesn't know that old age, not in a good sense, but in a bad sense, is creeping in. He's unaware. It reminds me of the story of Samson. Remember how Samson had his hair cut by Delilah and didn't realize that he had lost his strength, did not realize that he had lost the blessing of God until it was too late. Chapter 7 and verse 10, though the pride of Israel testifies against him, yet they have not returned to the Lord their God, nor have they sought him for all this. In spite of all the things happening, losing their freedoms, losing their prosperity, losing their crops, financial hardship, emotional hardship, and unsettledness, yet they have not returned to the Lord their God. Chapter 7, verse 11, so Ephraim has become like a silly dove. Now, there's perhaps a little pun here. I don't know if it's deliberate. Sometimes a pun is intended, sometimes it's not intended. Notice, Ephraim has become like a silly dove without sense. They call to Egypt, and Egypt there is to the south, was one of the not real superpower, but bigger than Israel. Or they go to Assyria. And so here are these other big powers that lived on either side of Israel, one down in Egypt, one down in Assyria, and neither one was going to be a help. But notice, Israel has become like a silly dove. The way you say that in Hebrew, Israel has become like a silly Jonah. And remember, I said back in our introduction that Jonah seems to have lived maybe just a bit earlier than this point. So it might have been that the story of Jonah, if it hadn't been written, perhaps at least it had already taken place. And I can't help but think of Jonah, what he does in his silliness, going and trying to run from God. Doesn't run down to Egypt, doesn't run to Assyria, but he's sent by God to Assyria. And even at the end of the book of Jonah, it just looks a bit silly on his part because he's fighting against God. And Ephraim is now walking in the footsteps of that silly dove, that silly Jonah. Chapter 8, verse 1, put the trumpet to your lips. Like an eagle, the enemy comes against the house of the Lord. Because they have transgressed my covenant and rebelled against my law, they cry out to me, my God, we of Israel know you. They're claiming to know God, but in reality, they don't. In fact, I think of the echo of the words that Jesus gave toward the end of his Sermon on the Mount, when he speaks of those who will say, Lord, we did all these great things. And he would turn to them and say, I never knew you. Verse 3, Israel has rejected the good. The enemy will pursue him. They have set up kings, but not by me. They have appointed princes, but I did not know it. With their silver and gold, they have made idols for themselves, that they might be cut off. Here is Israel trying all sorts of things, whether it's kings or politics or let's elect this person's president, surely, or do the money or do the idol worship. And whatever they have tried, it has only hastened their demise. Verse 5, he has rejected your calf, O Samaria. Now you'll remember the golden calf that they built when Moses came down from Sinai, that Aaron had constructed a golden calf. But many years later, after Israel separated from the Union, where you had Israel in the north and Judah in the south, the northern 10 tribes of Israel, they had reinstituted the use of golden calves in their worship. They had set one up at Bethel and another at Dan. And God says, he has rejected your calf, O Samaria, saying, my anger burns against them. How long will they be incapable of innocence? For from Israel is even this, a craftsman made it, so it is not God. Surely the calf of Samaria will be broken to pieces. You can actually go to the high place in Dan, still there, the foundations, the temple itself, you're only looking at the foundations stones there, and they've put up a sort of an iron grating that shows where their altar would have been for this temple and this high place. And it was there that they had one of these golden calves. It's no longer there, and so it certainly shouldn't be anymore. Verse 7, for they sow the wind and they weep the whirlwind. The standing grain has no heads, it yields no grains. Here they're growing their crops, and the very part of the food that they eat, you don't eat the stalk, you eat the grain, that's missing. Should it yield, strangers would swallow it up. Even if it was growing, others would come and take it. Israel is swallowed up. They are now among the nations like a vessel in which no one delights. So it's describing the Assyrian captivity, where Israel is going to be taken away into captivity and uprooted and will cease to be a nation. Verse 9, for they have gone up to Assyria. That's what takes place, is Israel is captured. Remember, we said that the book of Hosea is written over an extended period of time. And so notice how the translators rendered this. They have gone up. It's already a done deal by this time. They've gone up to Assyria like a wild donkey all alone. Ephraim has hired lovers, even though they hire allies among the nations. Now I will gather them up, and they will begin to diminish because of the burden of the king of princes. Verse 11, since Ephraim has multiplied altars for sin, they have become altars of sinning for him. Though I wrote for him 10,000 precepts of my law. God says, look, and I'm not saying there's literally 10,000 laws, but God says, look, I wrote and I sent prophets and I gave them instructions. But notice they are regarded as a strange thing. In other words, they're ignored. They're saying, who needs that? Verse 13, as for my sacrificial gifts, they sacrifice the flesh and eat it. But the Lord has taken no delight in them. This is talking about what you would do with a sacrifice. You would actually sacrifice it. Part of it you would eat. But God's not in it. Here they are going through these religious rituals. They're going through sacrificial meals where they eat part of it. And God's not there. Now he will remember their iniquity and punish them for their sins. They will return to Egypt. And it's not saying literally they're going down to Egypt, although frankly, we do read about some of the Jews who do end up going down into Egypt. And we know this from archaeology, where we've actually found some Jewish remnants from this later age down in Egypt. But what I think he's really saying is they're going into slavery, they're going into captivity, just like they had been in captivity when they had been in Egypt. Verse 14, for Israel has forgotten his maker and built palaces. And notice every once in a while it brings Judah into the picture too. Here it is. And Judah has multiplied fortified cities, but I will send a fire on its cities that it may consume its palatial dwellings. And that's going to happen. Not only will Israel be taken into captivity, but most of the cities of Judah will be taken and captured and burned as well. That's going to happen in the days of Hezekiah. We come to chapter 10 now, verse 1. Israel is a luxurious vine. He produces fruit for himself. The more his fruit, the more altars he made, the richer his land, the better he made the sacred pillars. Their heart is faithlessness. Now they must bear their guilt. So Israel had gotten very religious, but it was the wrong religion. They were worshiping at pagan altars. And now, notice the Lord will break down their altars and destroy their sacred pillars. We jump down to verse 9. From the days of Gibeah, you have sinned, O Israel. Gibeah, some things that had taken place going all the way back to the days of Joshua, but perhaps here are some references to things that took place there in 1st and 2nd Samuel. Some things that had taken place that had resulted in the death of a dynasty. There they stand. Will not the battle against the sons of iniquity overtake them in Gibeah? And so there's a number of references here. We're not going to trace all of those down. But Gibeah, if you remember, had been initially a Canaanite city that the Israelites had made peace with. Now, it was under a guise of where they had been deceived, a guise of deception. But notice, will not the battle against the sons of iniquity overtake them in Gibeah? Things are going to come home to roost. Both that early scenario, but also some certain issues of treachery that had taken place in the days, like I said, 2nd Samuel. The story is told of David's rise to power. David had not had a direct part in that. He had benefited, but it wasn't his doing. But it was Joab that actually dealt treacherously against Abner, and that's a whole story there. Verse 11, Ephraim is a trained heifer that loves to thresh, but I will come over her fair neck with a yoke. Now notice, Ephraim, that is the northern kingdom, they are likened to a cow that loves to do its thing, but notice is going to be put under bondage. I will harness Ephraim, Judah will plow, Jacob will harrow for himself, and we're going to enter in now to an agricultural theme. Verse 12, sow with a view to righteousness. And remember, we said Jezreel. The name Jezreel means sown of God, and that refers both to the scattering of Israel, but also the planting of Israel. And the term sowing there has both ideas at once. But here it's being planted. Be planted with a view to righteousness. Reap in accordance with kindness. Break up your fallow ground, your hard ground that needs to be broken up so that you can do that planting. For it is time to seek the Lord until he comes to rain righteousness on you. All sorts of metaphors and descriptions of planting and how Israel is to plant righteousness and kindness and to break up their hardened hearts. And so there's a call for kindness, a call for, remember, this is our term for loyalty earlier, chesed. It's being used here. This is our same old friend, chesed. Verse 13, you have plowed wickedness. You have reaped injustice. They've been planting the wrong crops. You have eaten the fruit of lies because you have trusted in your way, in your numerous warriors. The song says, I did it my way. And God says, that's why you're being judged. You did it your way instead of the way that I gave for you to do. Verse 14, therefore a tumult will arise among your people, and all your fortresses will be destroyed. As Shalman destroyed Beth Arbel on the day of battle, something from the past history, when mothers were dashed in pieces with their children. Verse 15, thus it will be done to you at Bethel because of your great wickedness. At dawn, the king of Israel will be completely cut off. The sun is going to rise, and it will arise on a destroyed northern kingdom. So we have this message of judgment. This is chapters 4 through 10. This is what we've been reading. But now, as we come to chapter 11, we're going to see a song of hope. We start off in chapter 11, verse 1. We haven't started the song yet. But notice, when Israel was a youth, I loved him. And out of Egypt, I called my son. Now, that's probably a passage that's familiar to you from when it's quoted in Matthew chapter 2. Matthew 2 quotes this passage to point to Jesus, to say, look, there's a sense in which those words echo in the life, the early life of Jesus. And yet when we read the passage in its context, it's not speaking in terms of a future prophecy or future prediction, but it's speaking about how Israel came out of Egypt as God's son. Verse 2, the more they called them, the more they went from them. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning incense to altars. Yet it is I who taught Ephraim to walk. She was a youth, just a baby. I took them in my arms, but they did not know that I healed them. I set up Israel. I set up Ephraim. They are there because I planted them, and yet they have forgotten, and they did not even know me. Verse 4, I led them with cords of a man, with bonds of love, and I became to them as one who lifts the yoke from their jaws, and I bent down and fed them. Here I nurtured, I released them from their former slavery. Verse 5, they will not return to the land of Egypt. Instead, they're going to a different place of captivity. But Assyria, he will be their king. Why? Because they refuse to return to me. And so, yes, God says, I brought them out of Egypt. I planted them in the land. But now Assyria is going to come, and they will be taken away into Assyria. Verse 8, how can I give you up, O Ephraim? How can I surrender you, O Israel? How can I make you like Admah? How can I treat you like Zeboim? My heart is turned over within me. All my compassions are kindled. I'm watching you be punished. And how can I deny my own heart? And here we see hope for the future and the heart of the Lord for his people. Continues in verse 9, I will not execute my fierce anger. I will not destroy Ephraim again, for I am God and not man, the Holy One in your midst, and I will not come in wrath. They will walk after the Lord. He will roar like a lion. Indeed, he will roar. Aslan is on the march. We're going to see that roaring like a lion repeated again, both in Amos and Joel. He'll roar like a lion. Indeed, he will roar, and his sons will come trembling from the west. They will come trembling like birds from Egypt and like doves from the land of Assyria. Notice there's promised, yes, they've been scattered, but I'm going to bring them back home. Now, he didn't do that immediately. It's not, we talk about the Babylonian captivity being 70 years and then they came back. The 10 northern tribes did not come back as tribal units, but here is pictured a return where they come back. Notice, I will settle them in their houses, declares the Lord. And so our passage is going to close. As we come to a close, we're going to settle with a message of hope, because God's going to bring them back. Now, this brings up the question, when does he do that? And my answer is that he does this with the coming of Messiah. And I'm not talking about just the second coming. I'm talking about the first coming. When Jesus came, he came to call his people home, to a new home, not just some real estate in the Middle East, but a home that would encompass the entire world, a home that would encompass all of the nations, where he would bring them all to himself. What did he say to his disciples? Go make disciples of all the nations, because I have given that to you as your inheritance.